Voters give their midterm verdict in 16 days, and many are now saying that their top concerns are the state of the economy and crime, both issues that look like they might help Republican candidates on Election Day. This week, we got an important glimpse at the House Republicans' agenda if they ride a red wave back into power. And joining me now to talk about the GOP agenda is GOP Congresswoman Nancy Mace of South Carolina. Congresswoman, thanks so much for joining us. So the Washington Post has a new editorial this weekend. It's interesting. It has some criticism for President Biden on the economy. They also propose a few steps he could take to help reduce inflation. One of them is lifting some of the Trump tariffs against China. Would you support doing that to help lower prices for the American people?
Well, I actually proposed a bill when we had the baby formula shortage that would lift tariffs all over the world on baby formula imports, no matter where they were coming from. I think that tariffs can be utilized when we're negotiating different deals or trade deals with other countries. But at the end of the day, it is an increased cost on the consumer. And that's one example where I worked actively to try to bring prices down and bring greater inventory when that issue happened. And that is a place where you can see some benefit.
So what about lifting them more broadly? There are a lot of Trump tariffs, and I've seen estimates saying that it adds about $500 to $1,000 per family in this country. That's just one estimate, but it would help alleviate some of the inflation. Would you lift all of them?
Yes, I do agree with that. Lifting tariffs makes the cost of goods cheaper for every American. But one of the other things that we have to look at, and it cannot be ignored, is government spending. Now, for decades, both Republicans and Democrats alike have had issues with increasing the deficit and deficit spending. We've got to look at our government spending. We need to look at, more broadly, the supply chain and incentivizing companies perhaps to get out of China and come back to North America, the United States, Central and South America, a little bit closer here. So the price of shipping goods and manufacturing goods, if we can get those prices down and make the supply chain more efficient, that's one way. Another thing that we have to address are taxes in this country. The infrastructure bill last year, there were 42 new taxes. And so all these things contribute to the rise in inflation. And of course, Congress can't control the Fed, but when you print trillions and trillions of dollars every single year, again, that's just another factor into issues that increase inflation.
Republican leader Kevin McCarthy suggested that if your party wins back the House, he would refuse to lift the debt limit unless Democrats in the White House agree to spending cuts. Are you on board with that plan? Are you willing to risk the U.S. defaulting on its debt as leverage to impose these spending cuts?
I support that strategy because, look, at the end of the day, when COVID-19 happened, you had the federal government and state governments to literally shut companies down. Businesses had to make tough decisions about how they were going to keep their doors open. And the federal government just kept getting record revenue year over year and hasn't had to make those tough decisions. And I can tell you, I sit on the oversight committee where we look at waste, fraud, and abuse at the federal agency level, and there is waste in every single agency. I was happy to see there were 44 people charged with a crime of defrauding the government over $250 million over PPP funds, but that is everywhere. It is broad. It's in every agency. We can find ways to be more responsible with our spending, just like we forced companies and businesses to during COVID. So that's one of the ways that I would approach it.
But isn't the way to do that through legislating, through meeting with leaders of the Senate, whoever's in charge of that party, meeting with people in the White House and coming up with a way to reduce spending, or at least to reduce the rate that spending is going up, instead of potentially defaulting, which, you know, we've seen it happen. It wreaks havoc on the economy and hurts working people, among others.
Well, we've seen Republicans for a year and a half now talk about more responsible spending, looking at the deficit spending and these bills that have been passed, talking about how we can move this country forward. And we've been shut out. I know when we did the infrastructure bill on the House side anyway last year, every Republican was shut out of being part of that discussion, not a single amendment. And I had a couple of nonpartisan amendments, for example. So Republicans have tried to reach across the aisle and have been shut out of many of those conversations. And so I think that is a way to negotiate moving forward, but we have to get serious about it. And I filed a bill earlier this year that would balance the budget in about 5 years. looking at making spending cuts about 5 cents for every future dollar the federal government spent. If we made those cuts across every agency, you could balance the budget in 5 years. That's responsible, it's reasonable, and it gives the federal government a time frame, 5 years, to be able to do that. And that seems very normal. If we could do that, then we wouldn't need to threaten, use the threat of the debt ceiling as a negotiating tool.
Right. Well, you're in the minority now. I'm talking about if you're in the majority, you're going to have a little bit more clout. But let's move on, because Republican leader Kevin McCarthy also seemed to cast doubt on whether a Republican-controlled House would continue to help Ukraine push back against its Russian invasion. He told Punchbowl News this week, quote, "I think people are going to be sitting in a recession and they're not going to write a blank check to Ukraine. They just won't do it. Ukraine's important, but at the same time, it can't be the only thing they do, and it can't be a blank check." So I know you traveled to Ukraine during the war. You promised to support their efforts to beat back the Russian invasion as long as Ukrainians are willing to fight. Are you worried about what Kevin McCarthy said about Ukraine aid?
And look, I supported Ukraine aid early on when it happened. I did travel to the border, but Bloomberg last week, and this is an issue we have to reconcile, but Bloomberg said last week that we're going to have a recession. It's 100% guaranteed. We saw Jamie Dimon warn on a recession in the next 6 to 9 months. And if we keep writing these blank checks to other countries, if we increase the deficit spending or government spending any more than we already have, we are going to exacerbate the situation. But make no mistake, Ukraine is very important, not only to the United States economy, but to countries all around the world. And so there's going to have to be some sort of balance. You look at the rare earth minerals in Ukraine, from neon and palladium to the food security issues that may be on the horizon with wheat and barley in particular, the lumber and timber that they produce, or the nuclear assets that Russia is after. It is something that we're going to have to find balance on next year.
Don't you think a comment like the one Kevin McCarthy made, don't you think Vladimir Putin just hears that? He says, well, this guy's probably going to be the next speaker. I just have to stick it out until Republicans take over the House. So I'm just going to keep fighting. Republicans are going to end U.S. support or lessen U.S. support for Ukraine. And, don't you think it sends a signal like that, or at least risks sending that signal?
Well, I do think Vladimir Putin has lost his marbles. I think that he is willing to raise the stakes in any way, shape, or form to cause destruction, not only for Ukraine, but other countries. He's now building alliances with China and Iran. That is not good for the United States of America either. And we have to project strength on the world stage. I can tell you, when I was overseas, both in Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific region last year, that when we have the kind of division we have in our country today, and that is politically especially, we look weak on the world stage. And I think one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin feels emboldened isn't because of what Republicans are saying they may or may not do, is because of months, a year and a half, 2 years now, more than that even, but the divisions that we have and unwilling to work together on some of these issues and just the fighting, it makes us look weak on the world stage. And that is something that I am urging both sides to work on, no matter who's in the majority after November. And I do believe Republicans will be in the majority, and we're looking at a potential 53-seat majority in the Senate now.
You've said that there's pressure on Republicans to vote to impeach President Biden or to vote to impeach top Biden cabinet officials. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik suggested impeachment was on the table in a New York Post interview this week. Do you think President Biden has committed any impeachable offenses?
That is something that would have to be investigated. I am not interested in playing tit for tat. I am not interested in retaliation. Impeachment has been weaponized over the years, and we've seen that. I really want us to be focused on the economy, on tackling inflation with responsible policy. We also need to look at crime and immigration. We've had 4.2 million illegal immigrants cross the border illegally at the southern border since Biden was sworn into office. We've got fentanyl racing across every street in America. And in fact, there was enough fentanyl discovered in South Carolina 2 weeks ago to kill 1 million people. And so we've got to get very serious about those issues. And that's where I believe our focus should be when Republicans are in the majority.
All right, Congresswoman Nancy Mace of South Carolina, thanks so much for spending time today with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.